Self-heroism, the triumph of the traumatized inner child. Okay, that's the topic of this analysis. So let's begin by going to the past. A traumatized inner child, obviously conditioned in a very toxic upbringing, in a toxic environment. Perhaps you came from an environment of negligence, in which your parents or caretakers were emotionally unavailable or even narcissistic. Perhaps you came up in an environment that was quarrelsome, in which they were going at it. Your parents were going at it. It was disruptive, high tension, toxic. Perhaps you came up in an environment of alcoholism and substance abuse, or an environment of OCD, with a very overbearing parent who was overly critical, or an overprotective parent who was very paranoid. Perhaps you came up in a competitive environment, where the parents pit the siblings against each other, like your brother will always get the better grades, or your sister will always be a better cheerleader. Very hurtful. Or perhaps you came up in an environment of poverty, or a violent environment in which the child is in physical and moral danger, or an environment of sexual abuse in which a little child is having to endure sexual abuse. Now, the topic that I want to define here is just that version of you, that inner child, okay? Now, most people don't seek or even think of the concept of recovery, who've been through traumatic upbringing. They get out finally. They reach a point where they're finally getting out. They're leaving home finally. They're leaving that BS behind, right? But, living with this kind of trauma, it puts you at a severe disadvantage, right? Socially, intimately, career-wise, and just your general peace of mind, right? And you find that over the years, or even decades, that you're not free. And so the nightmare continues unwittingly, okay, in myriads of ways. Usually, more commonly, you play it out in your romantic relationships. Not limited to, but more than likely in your private life, in your intimate relations. And you find yourself in a pattern, in cycles. What I like to call the 2 to 3 year glitch. It's that point in which a relationship starts to unravel, and usually, more often than not, comes to a traumatic end, right? Now, you can apply this to social circles, friendship circles, and business associations as well. And you're basically living in a circle of trauma, right? You're piling trauma on top of that, all that trauma on top of that initial trauma, and just, you're building up trauma, right? And it's almost as if your life feels like some sort of cruel, satirical farce. And you're confronted with the bitter question of why, right? Why? What can it be that I have done? Why me? And I'll tell you why. And that's because of unfinished business, okay? It's because we ourselves have abandoned ourselves, okay? Just like our parents did before us. We have abandoned our inner child. And that inner child is desperately in need of help. It needs to be saved, okay? And this is a matter of such profound consequence, okay? And that's because your birthright to live and experience true joy and true love is at stake here. And I'm sure that many of you who are watching this and resonating with this can appreciate the gravitas that I'm conveying here, right? And for many, this is a matter of life or death, physically and figuratively. Now, you can die inside your living body, right? It happens all the time. Now, in mainstream society, most people snicker and sneer and scoff at the concept of an inner child. But I'll tell you this. You want to know who's really running the show? Okay? It's not the adult. Okay? No, it's not. It's the inner child. And I'll tell you why. And that's because the inner child's dwelling place, the inner child's terrain or kingdom, so to speak, is the subconscious mind. Okay? And as we all know, it's the subconscious that's running the show. It's what's happening backstage that's running the show. Okay? Now, a traumatized and unrecovered inner child is unseemingly and unbelievably, incredibly powerful. And that's because of her desperate need for attention, for healing, for recovery. And in pursuit of that recovery, that inner child can be demonstrous, even dangerous. Now you see that deep-rooted abandonment and injustice that you feel in your core is still unresolved, right? Due to your self-negligence, which, by the way, is not your fault, okay? You were taught by example, by how your parents treated you, okay? You picked it up from your parents, so it's their fault, okay? They're the ones responsible. It was their responsibility to make sure you were okay. You know, a child is a product of circumstance, right? You know, a child is just born very vulnerable, and it is a parent's responsibility to care for that child and nurture and guide that child, right? And if they don't do that correctly, it's their responsibility. It's not yours, okay? And a lot of our parents, you know, just left us, abandoned us with trauma, and left us to fend for ourselves, right? Left us to our own devices, you know, unrecovered, unequipped to deal with and navigate around life's circumstances. And they left us hungry for love, for approval. You know, they left us with the need to be heard, to be cared for, to be nurtured, to be guided, and to be celebrated, right? These are all things that they should have done, right? They should have cherished us. They should have encouraged us. You know, they should have strengthened us and deeply and healthily love us. Okay. Now you can see how impoverished that can feel for a child, for our inner child, to not get to experience those things, those milestones of emotions, right? Those emotional milestones, or even to feel acknowledged in any sort of substantial way by our parents, or celebrated for our unique development as individuals, as we grew into who we are, right? It's somewhat akin to being an orphan left in the woods, you know. It's a very traumatic, lonely, and hollow feeling that cuts deep to the bone. And right? You grow up living with this sort of undefined, sort of unacknowledged in any substantial or concise way sense of wanderlust, right? A wanderlust for approval, for comfort, you know, for safety, for certainty, for true love, right? And this wanderlust is wild and feral. To sum it up, you're living in a state of suffering. And there's no romance or no achievement that can satiate that emptiness, that need for justice to be heard, that need for that inner child to be saved. That child needs saving, and it's that child's birthright. And the only way is to go through, right? The only way is to save your own inner child. That's going to involve self-parenting. And here's where the self-heroism comes into play. Now, by embracing your inner child, embracing him or her, in working in tandem, you become the engineers of your psyche, of your subconscious terrain. And it is your inner child who has the keys to that kingdom, to that dimension. Okay? Now, to arrive at this junction is a process that most live their whole lives never beginning that journey. Now, I want you all to really think about that version of you. Really think about him or her. Really connect, okay? And get into the habit of addressing him or her when your triggers come up or traumatic situations arise, okay? And you're going to start noticing that you're going to start connecting the dots, that certain root events from your childhood that paved the way or that planted those seeds of dysfunction will start rising up to the surface. Okay. And here's where you become like the data engineers, right? Because you're able to define these traumas or these this root footage and these artificial root beliefs and artificial self-opinions. Now, I call them artificial because they were not organic. They weren't of you. Okay, they were instilled into you by your parents or by outer forces, things and persons outside of yourself, right? Now, as each subsequent root sort of trauma or footage is revealed, you can disambiguate it, and it can be defined and verified and filed away, right? Now that you're the data engineer, you're the one who's writing the script, rewriting the code. And it's a very deep process. Many emotions will come to the surface. You might find yourself crying. You may even find yourself yelling into thin air, in a rage. And that's okay, You have every right to feel enraged, okay? All right? And as you express your rage, your trauma, you begin to accept it, put it in its place, and it begins to dissipate, right? It's always going to be part of you. But now you have a filing system, and you are able to navigate where your triggers come from, their place of origin. And this is the part of the story where things begin to shift, and the inner hero is made evident, right? It's that allegory, of the child coming face to face with a beast. It's a very ancient allegory, and from all cultures globally, all over the world. And I think it's so relevant because it's true, it's real. This is a real thing, right? Coming face to face with the beast, your inner child, coming into his or her role as the hero, hence self-heroism. It's kind of like the Archangel Michael with the dragon at his feet, right? And you're challenged, right? You're challenged to take this journey and to turn your traumatized inner child into the hero, into the star of the story, okay? Now I'm sending you light and love and clarity and joy, all right? Thanks for watching. Thumbs up, subscribe, share. Appreciate it.